There was no time, no sound, no light. It wasn't dark because dark was a concept of something. Here, there was nothing. An absence that could not be measured, compared, or named. Yet, this stillness held a weight, like waiting for something to happen, though there was no one to wait for anything. What does it mean for something to begin? Does it come from nothing, or does it exist in potential long before it's seen? And who determines when it is time for potential to become reality? In this stillness, long before there were names, laws, or limits, there was no push for creation. There was no desire or will, no force shaping what would come. If anyone could witness it, they would struggle to call it empty, because even emptiness is defined by a boundary between what is and what isn't. This was something else entirely, the waiting before the idea of waiting. For countless eternities, or perhaps none at all, this space remained untouched. Untouched because there was nothing to touch. No stirring, no thought, no awareness. And then, like a whisper without sound, something stirred. Not a force, not a will, but a quiet spark, one that did not yet burn, but only existed in the purest sense. The smallest flicker of a presence in the absence. Not light, not fire, but a breath that could not be traced. This wasn't an arrival, not an act of becoming. It simply was. With that, the very idea of time took shape. It wasn't linear, not yet. There were no seconds, no rhythms. But time, as a principle, existed because now there was something that wasn't before. And with that existence, there came the smallest shift. The tiniest ripple in the vastness, hinting that things were no longer as they had been, if they had ever been at all. Creation did not burst forth in a flurry of light or noise. There was no grand explosion to announce the beginning. Instead, it unfolded quietly, as if existence itself was shy to emerge. From that single flicker of something came another, then another. They didn't rush. Each one appeared when it was ready, expanding the space around them without forcing the issue. The first points of light came as distant echoes, small and scattered. These weren't stars yet. They were ideas of stars, pieces of what would one day be whole. They took their time. There was no rush for them to find their shape. In their own way, they seemed to know that what they were about to become would last for ages. As more lights blinked into being, space began to stretch. Not as a reaction, but as part of the same unfolding. Galaxies were not flung across the cosmos like some careless scattering. They appeared gently, each one finding its place without contesting the others. It was not chaos, it was calm. This was creation with patience, a slow and deliberate emergence, as if the very nature of existence demanded careful thought before each piece was allowed to settle. And yet, in all this vastness, no purpose announced itself. There were no grand designs, no intent behind this slow birth of everything. There was only becoming. Stars found their places, galaxies spun themselves into existence, and still there was no sound. The quiet remained, unbroken by the motions of creation. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of pure presence, as though the universe was listening to itself form, unwilling to speak until it fully understood what it was. In time, and time had now taken on meaning, though it was still hard to measure, life stirred. Not on a single world, but across many. But it was not immediate. Life, like the stars, did not rush. It too took its time, growing in the smallest ways, unnoticed at first, because there was no one to notice. The first signs of life were like the first flickers of light, small, unassuming, but full of potential. As the stars settled into their courses and the galaxies found their patterns, this life began to spread, silently, patiently, and slowly, over more eons than could ever be counted. A species came to be, a species capable of wondering about all of this. Humans, tiny in comparison to the vastness, insignificant in the scope of the cosmic dance, but different in one simple way. They asked why. This question was not born from knowledge, but from a quiet stirring inside them. It didn't matter how advanced their understanding would become or how far they would eventually reach. The question of existence was embedded in them before they even took their first breath. As if, in the moment they came to be, they carried with them a faint memory of the stillness before creation. They were born into motion, but carried the quiet of the beginning within their minds. And yet, in their frailty, they were bound by the limits of their world, their thoughts too small to truly grasp the magnitude of where they fit. But the universe is not kind, nor cruel, it simply is. So, humans were left to their own devices, to struggle, to rise, and to fall as they searched for meaning in the stars, not realizing that they were as much a part of the unfolding as the stars themselves. In this vastness, one life in particular flickered, faint, unnoticed. A human, not yet born, but destined for something beyond their own understanding. This life did not arrive with fanfare or significance. It did not announce itself. In fact, it barely existed at all, a mere speck in the endless flow of existence. But the universe doesn't measure significance in size or strength. This human would go unnoticed, like a single breath in the middle of a storm. But they were not unimportant, for in the vast unfolding of creation, even the smallest flicker could alter the course of stars. But before that could happen, before they could make their mark on the universe, they would first have to find their place within it. In the distant future, when they would be called to battle forces far beyond their understanding, they would not do so as a hero or a legend. They would come as the weakest of soldiers, a fragile life with no right to stand among the giants of the cosmos. But even the fragile are capable of resilience, and in that moment, they would be forced to reckon with the meaning of existence, of their existence. Yet for now, they were nothing more than a possibility, a faint ember in the grand cosmos. There was no rush for them to emerge. The universe had waited long enough, and it would wait longer still. But in this stillness, as existence quietly unfolded, there was a pause, a single heartbeat, a breath. And with that breath came the first faint stirrings of awareness. It was not a mind forming yet, not a body being shaped, but a spark, a reminder that even in the vastness of everything, something was about to happen. And so, with that quiet moment, time truly began. Not the time of stars or galaxies, but the time of something conscious enough to measure its own heartbeat against the silence of eternity. The stars had been there long before anyone had the eyes to see them. They had burned, merged, and collapsed, spinning through the silence of space without witness or reason. It wasn't until Earth, fragile and improbable, formed from the scattered dust of those very stars that something changed. The planet came into being quietly, like everything else. No grand announcement, no instant life. It took ages, far longer than any human mind could comprehend, for Earth to become what it was. The seas churned and settled, the air thickened with elements that would one day allow for breath. And yet, there was no urgency, no purpose driving the process forward. But life, as always, found its way. From the depths of the ocean, from the simplest of organisms, came the complex, the intelligent, and eventually, humanity. Humanity's rise was a slow burn. They weren't destined to rule the stars from the beginning. For centuries, they struggled. They were fragile, small creatures fighting against the harshness of their own world, unaware of the greater universe surrounding them. But as the species evolved, so too did their questions. They began to look at the stars not just as distant lights, but as something more, something worth understanding. And in that understanding, they found a purpose, whether imposed by themselves or whispered by the universe itself was unclear. But the purpose was undeniable. They wanted to reach beyond what they knew. Generations passed, and slowly, humanity moved from wondering to doing. They built tools, created fire, and eventually, after thousands of years, they left their planet, unsure of what they would find, but driven by something primal. The stars no longer seemed unreachable. They became destinations, and Earth, in all its beauty, began to feel small. The sanctuary it provided felt fragile compared to the vastness of space, but that fragility was what made it special. The green of its forests, the blue of its oceans, the air that filled human lungs, all of it stood in stark contrast to the unforgiving nature of the void beyond. It was a miracle, one they barely understood, but instinctively sought to protect, even as they reached beyond it. The child was born into this world where humanity had already touched the stars. There was no longer awe in the fact that people lived on planets far beyond Earth, in colonies and outposts scattered through the galaxy. Space travel, once the dream of countless generations, was now routine. And yet, for all the progress, there remained a sense of something missing, something not yet achieved. He was weak from birth, his bones brittle, his muscles thin. As a child, he watched other children run and climb with ease while he struggled to stand. The medics had assured his parents that he would be fine, that his condition was manageable, but in his heart, he knew better. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't like anyone. And yet, from his earliest memories, he felt drawn to the sky. Not just in the way that children were often fascinated by the stars, but with a deeper, unspoken connection. While the other children played games of war, mimicking the soldiers they admired, he would sit in silence, staring up at the stars that seemed to call to him in ways he couldn't explain. He was told that he was born in the wrong body, that his frailty was a curse. Others pitied him, some ignored him, and a few mocked him. But he didn't care. None of it mattered to him, not really. What mattered were the questions he asked himself in the quiet moments when no one else was around. Why was he here, in this body, in this time, on this planet? What was the purpose of a life so insignificant? He often wondered whether the stars even noticed the existence of Earth, let alone the tiny creatures crawling on its surface. And if they didn't notice, did it matter? Did anything? As he grew, his questions only deepened. He learned about the history of humanity's rise, how they had climbed from the depths of ignorance and struggle, only to continue fighting amongst themselves. He read about wars fought over meaningless lines in the sand, about people killed for ideas they barely understood, and about the relentless drive for power that seemed to consume his species. The stars, on the other hand, were silent. They didn't fight. They didn't conquer. They existed, unbothered by the smallness of human concerns. And yet, humans continued to reach for them, to grasp at the heavens as if they could wrestle meaning from the universe itself. It was a paradox he could never quite understand. Why was humanity so determined to escape its own planet, to expand into the unknown, while they continued to destroy what little they had? Earth, though small, was their sanctuary. It was the only place they truly belonged. Yet they treated it as disposable, something to be left behind in the pursuit of something greater. But what was greater than life itself, than the gift of existence on this fragile world? One evening, as the boy sat alone under the night sky, he watched the stars with the same intensity he always had. The air was cool, a soft breeze rustling the leaves around him. He could hear the distant hum of machinery from the nearby spaceport, where ships came and went, carrying travelers to and from distant worlds. But here, in this moment, it was just him and the stars. He had heard stories of how humanity had once looked at the night sky with wonder, believing the stars to be gods or spirits watching over them. Now, they knew better. The stars were just balls of gas, burning in the void, indifferent to the lives of the beings that watched them. But knowing the science didn't make them any less beautiful. He wondered if the stars had seen the rise of humanity, if they had noticed the first flicker of fire, the first leap into space. Or were they too far removed, too vast to care? There was a tension in his chest that night, a restlessness that had been growing for years. The more he learned, the more he questioned, and the more he questioned, the less sense everything seemed to make. He was supposed to feel awe, they told him. He was supposed to feel pride in his species, in all that they had achieved. But he couldn't. Not when the questions kept nagging at him, pulling him in directions he couldn't understand. What was the point of all this? What was the point of reaching the stars, of building ships and colonies, if they still didn't know why they were here, why he was here? His thoughts drifted to the future. He had no interest in following the path of the soldiers or the explorers. His body was too weak for that anyway. But beyond that, he couldn't see the point. They trained and fought, pushing themselves to the limit. For what? Survival? Expansion? Conquest? He knew his place in the universe was small. But did that mean his life had no value? Did the size of his existence determine its worth? These were the questions he wrestled with, and they never had clear answers. But then again, maybe they weren't meant to. As he continued to stare at the stars, he became aware of the silence around him. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. He felt the weight of the universe pressing down on him, not as a burden, but as a reminder that despite everything, despite the wars and the destruction and the questions that had no answers, he was still here. He was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For the first time in years, he let out a deep breath. It didn't answer his questions, but it didn't need to. Not now. He knew that the questions would always be there, that they would follow him for the rest of his life. But for this moment, he allowed himself to simply exist, to be part of the universe without needing to understand it. The stars remained distant, cold, and indifferent. But for the boy, they no longer seemed quite so far away. They were part of him, just as he was part of them. And maybe that connection, that quiet, unspoken bond, was all the purpose he needed. He stood up slowly, his bones aching from the effort. His body was weak, but his mind was clear. He would never be strong like the others. He would never be a soldier or a hero. But he was here, and that was enough. As he looked up at the stars one last time before heading inside, he felt a strange sense of peace. The universe was vast and unknowable, but that didn't make him insignificant. It just made him part of something much larger. Humanity had carved its mark across the cosmos. Where once the stars were distant, unattainable specks of light, they had become stages of conflict and survival. The galactic war was no longer a distant threat, but a brutal reality. This war had not just altered the trajectory of human civilization, it had reshaped its very essence. Earth was now but one of many outposts in a galaxy fraught with peril. The stars, once symbols of hope, had become the battlegrounds of survival. In the midst of this sprawling conflict, Thomas Kincaid, a name that was almost always spoken with a note of pity or disdain, had found himself reluctantly drafted into the military. At 23, Thomas was anything but a model soldier. His frailty, once a mere inconvenience, was now a glaring liability. Yet, there he was, dressed in a uniform too large for his slight frame, thrust into a war where every soldier was expected to embody strength, courage, and resilience. The military, a structure meticulously designed to maximize efficiency and combat effectiveness, was a world apart from the civilian life Thomas had once known. It was a place where the strong were revered and the weak were dismissed. Each day was a reminder of his perceived inadequacy. He observed the other soldiers, their muscles honed through rigorous training, their faces etched with the hardened resolve of warriors. In contrast, Thomas felt like an afterthought, a byproduct of a system that valued physical prowess over personal worth. Yet, the nature of war is to strip away illusions. The battlefield, in its raw, unforgiving reality, reveals the truth behind the masks people wear. And on this day, the truth was harsh. Thomas found himself part of a convoy bound for an alien world, a planet marked as a critical outpost in the galactic struggle. The mission was simple: secure the area, repel the alien forces, and establish a forward base. The alien world was a striking contrast to Earth. The sky, an unsettling shade of violet, was streaked with strange, auroral patterns that danced and shimmered as if mocking the very notion of serenity. The terrain was a mixture of jagged rocks and luminescent flora, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and alien chemicals, a constant reminder that this was not Earth, and its rules did not apply. As the convoy landed and the soldiers disembarked, Thomas felt a wave of anxiety that was almost palpable. The noise, the urgency, the clamor of soldiers preparing for battle, it was overwhelming. He was given a rifle, but it felt foreign in his hands, a symbol of a role he didn't understand or embrace. He was supposed to be a soldier, but everything about him seemed to scream otherwise. The battle commenced with a ferocity that left no room for hesitation. The aliens were a formidable foe, advanced, ruthless, and relentless. Their technology was unlike anything human engineers had anticipated. They wielded weapons that disintegrated material on contact, creating flashes of light and sound that were as disorienting as they were deadly. Their tactics were precise and cold, their movements almost choreographed in their efficiency. Thomas moved with the rest of the unit, but he felt like a shadow, a mere spectator to the carnage unfolding around him. The camaraderie he saw among the soldiers was alien to him. He was an outsider, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional and psychological landscape of war. The soldiers fought with a sense of purpose, driven by a belief in their cause, a belief that Thomas struggled to share. For him, the war was a brutal reality, devoid of the grand narratives that others seemed to live by. As the skirmish raged on, Thomas found himself separated from the main group. His orders were lost in the chaos, his sense of direction disoriented. He stumbled through the battlefield, trying to make sense of the fragments of combat that surrounded him. The clash of metal, the explosions, the screams, everything was a blur of violence. In a twist of fate that could only be described as absurd, Thomas found himself in a position of relative safety. He had taken refuge behind a pile of debris, his heart pounding in his chest as the sounds of battle roared around him. He watched in horror as his comrades fell, one by one, their bodies crumpling under the relentless assault of the alien forces. It was not heroism that saved him but sheer luck. He happened to be in the right place at the right time. When the battle finally subsided, the field was littered with the remnants of both human and alien forces. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the combat had been. Thomas emerged from his hiding place, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing down on him. He had survived, but at what cost? The faces of the fallen soldiers haunted him, their eyes wide with unspoken pleas. He had been a passive observer to their deaths, spared not by his skill, but by chance. The return journey was a somber affair. The convoy, now reduced in numbers, moved back to their base, the survivors lost in their own thoughts. Thomas was silent, his mind reeling with questions he had no answers for. He had faced the battlefield, and it had revealed the brutal reality of his situation. He was weak, and in a world that demanded strength, his existence seemed almost absurd. He grappled with guilt and introspection. The war had shown him the raw, unvarnished truth of combat, its randomness, its brutality, and its indifferent nature. He had survived, but he was haunted by the question of why. What had he done to deserve survival? And more importantly, what was his place in this world that seemed to reward the strong and discard the weak? As the convoy approached their base, the familiar sight of the military camp seemed almost surreal. It was a sanctuary amidst the chaos, a place where the veneer of order and control could momentarily mask the brutal reality of war. Thomas entered the camp, his steps heavy with the weight of his experiences. He knew that the questions he had faced on the battlefield would not fade easily. They were part of him now, embedded in the fabric of his being. He looked around at the soldiers who had survived, their faces etched with the same weariness he felt. They were the strong, the ones who had fought and lived, and he was one of them, though his survival felt like an accident, a fluke. He wondered if he would ever find the answers he sought, or if he was destined to be forever caught between the worlds of the strong and the weak, the hero and the bystander. The convoy returned to the base, but the return was anything but triumphant. The once familiar landscape of the military camp now felt like a distant memory, an illusion of normalcy in the wake of a brutal reality. Thomas Kincaid stepped off the transport, his boots sinking slightly into the dust, and was greeted by the quiet that followed the chaos of battle. The silence was heavy, oppressive, a stark contrast to the cacophony of war. The base was a place of relative safety, but it bore the marks of recent conflict. The usual hum of activity was subdued. Soldiers moved with a sense of exhaustion that was more than physical. It was a weariness that seeped into their very souls. Their faces were lined with the stress of survival, their eyes shadowed with the weight of loss. The camp, once vibrant with the energy of preparation and training, now seemed to retreat inward, mirroring the internal struggles of its inhabitants. Thomas made his way to his quarters, his every step feeling like a journey through a fog of disillusionment. The room he entered was stark and utilitarian, a reflection of the utilitarian approach the military took towards its personnel. He sat on the edge of his bunk, the stark metal frame feeling cold beneath him. The walls were bare, the only adornments being a small window that offered a view of the devastated landscape outside. His thoughts were a torrent of confusion and despair. The faces of his fallen comrades haunted him, each face a fragment of a larger whole that had been torn apart by the violence of the battlefield. He could still hear their voices, the laughter and camaraderie they had shared, now replaced by the silence of their absence. Thomas had survived, but he did not feel like a survivor. Instead, he felt like a witness to a tragedy from which he had been inexplicably spared. As he stared at the ceiling, the room seemed to close in around him, a cocoon of despair that offered no escape. The once vibrant sense of purpose he had clung to was now a distant memory, overshadowed by the stark reality of his role in the war. He had been part of the battle, yes, but he had been a mere spectator to the carnage. His survival felt like an accident, an arbitrary twist of fate rather than a mark of any personal merit. The city outside, once bustling with life, now lay in ruins. The buildings, shattered and broken, stood as silent sentinels to the devastation wrought by the recent conflict. Smoke still curled upwards from the remnants of structures that had been consumed by the flames of war. The streets, once lively with the hum of everyday life, were now empty and silent. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the broken windows and down the deserted avenues. In the heart of this desolation, Thomas found himself confronted with the aftermath of battle. Families gathered in small, somber groups, their faces etched with the grief of loss. The mourning was palpable, a collective expression of sorrow that seemed to hang heavy in the air. The sense of community that had once defined their lives was now fractured, replaced by a somber recognition of their collective plight. Amidst this desolate landscape, Thomas was called upon to meet with his commanding officer. The officer's office was a stark contrast to the devastation outside, a space of order and control, with maps and strategic plans meticulously arranged. The officer, a figure of stern authority, regarded Thomas with a mixture of expectation and pity. "Private Kincaid," the officer began, his voice measured and devoid of any emotional undertone. "You've been recommended for a promotion." Thomas's heart sank. The promotion was not a reward for exceptional performance, but rather a reflection of the desperate need for experienced personnel in a rapidly deteriorating situation. The officer's words were clear. Thomas was being given a chance to rise in rank, to take on a role that would require more responsibility and, implicitly, more skill. The offer was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was an acknowledgement of his survival, a chance to move beyond his perceived weakness. On the other hand, it was a burden, one that came with the weight of expectation and the challenge of proving his worth in a role he had never been prepared for. Thomas grappled with the decision, his internal struggle mirroring the broader conflict that raged outside the walls of the base. As he left the officer's office, Thomas walked through the ruined city once more. The ghosts of the fallen seemed to follow him, their silent presence a constant reminder of the cost of war. He wandered through the streets, each step a reflection of his turmoil. The rubble and destruction around him were a metaphor for his own fractured sense of self. He had survived, but at what cost? The graves of his fallen comrades lay in a makeshift cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Thomas stood before them, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. Each grave was marked with a simple plaque, the names of those who had been lost, a stark reminder of the lives that had been sacrificed. He knelt by one of the graves, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. The names were familiar, the faces a blur of memories that now seemed both distant and painfully immediate. The question that plagued him was not one of survival, but of worth. Why had he been spared while others had fallen? What did his survival mean in the grand scheme of things? The promotion he had been offered seemed incongruous with his own sense of inadequacy. He felt unworthy of the responsibility that came with it, yet he also felt a deep, unsettling pressure to accept it. As night fell, the city's ruins were bathed in the cold light of the moon, casting long shadows over the landscape. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the distant cries of mourning and the occasional rumble of unsettled debris. Thomas remained at the gravesite, the questions of his worth and his place in this fractured world echoing in the quiet. He rose from the graves, his mind heavy with the decision that lay before him. The promotion was a crossroads, a moment that would define his path forward. He could accept it and face the challenge of proving his worth, or he could decline and remain in the shadow of his own perceived failure. The choice was both daunting and essential, a reflection of the broader questions of identity and purpose that he faced. As he left the cemetery, the decision loomed large in his mind. The world outside was still a battleground, and the future was uncertain. The next steps would determine not just his role in the war, but also his place in the broader narrative of humanity's struggle for survival. The night grew deeper, and with it, the weight of his decision grew heavier. Thomas knew that whatever choice he made, it would be a defining moment, one that would shape his path and perhaps the fate of those around him. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but it was a journey he would have to face with both courage and introspection. Thomas Kincaid stood at the edge of the training grounds, staring into the alien landscape that stretched out before him. The base had been relocated to a harsh world known as Epsilon 7, a place that defied the expectations of any civilized environment. The ground was a jagged expanse of blackened rock and twisted metal, scattered with toxic pools that glowed faintly under the pale light of the planet's distant sun. The sky above was a sickly hue, smeared with clouds of a toxic green that hinted at the planet's volatility. The harshness of Epsilon 7 was not merely physical. It was an affront to the senses, an alien world that seemed determined to challenge every preconceived notion of comfort and safety. The planet's surface was marked by deep fissures and volcanic vents, emitting plumes of steam that hissed like serpents. The air was thick, laden with a chemical stench that stung the nostrils and made each breath a conscious effort. Gravity was slightly less than Earth's, giving a sensation of floating just beneath the surface of physical exertion. Thomas's new mentor, a figure shrouded in anonymity and secrecy, had arrived with a reputation for unconventional methods. This mentor was known only by a codename, Astrius, and their face was always hidden behind a helmet with an opaque visor. The mentor's reputation was not built on physical prowess, but on an enigmatic ability to push recruits beyond their limits using methods that were as psychological as they were physical. The first day of training was a grueling ordeal. Astrius led Thomas through a series of exercises designed not just to test his strength, but to challenge his perception of reality. The training was not confined to traditional combat drills, but involved navigating through simulated environments that mimicked the most hostile aspects of Epsilon 7's terrain. The simulations included treacherous ravines, gravity wells, and venomous creatures that had to be avoided or neutralized using only one's wits. Thomas found himself in a chamber that mimicked a dense, fog-laden swamp. The air was filled with a thick mist that obscured vision, making each step uncertain. The ground was uneven and treacherous, with hidden pits that threatened to ensnare him with every misstep. As he moved forward, he could hear the faint whispers of unseen creatures. Their presence felt more than seen. The fog pressed against his skin, and every sound seemed amplified, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. Astrius watched from the shadows, their presence a constant but unseen influence. The mentor's instructions were terse and precise, delivered through a communication device that crackled intermittently. Remember, Thomas, the mind is the greatest weapon you possess. Your physical body can be broken, but your will and intellect are what define you. The days turned into weeks, and Thomas's training became a relentless cycle of mental and physical challenges. He learned to adapt to the harsh environment, using the planet's natural features to his advantage. The training was rigorous and unforgiving, but it was designed to build resilience and adaptability rather than mere brute strength. Astrius's methods were focused on enhancing mental acuity, training Thomas to perceive threats before they emerged, to think and act with precision under duress. One exercise involved traversing a maze filled with traps and illusions. The maze walls were made of a reflective material that distorted Thomas's perception, making it difficult to gauge distance and direction. As he navigated through the labyrinth, he had to rely on his instincts and analytical skills, deciphering patterns and avoiding pitfalls that were more psychological than physical. Thomas struggled at first, often finding himself disoriented and overwhelmed. But with each failure, he learned. His failures became lessons, and his lessons became insights. He discovered that true strength was not just about enduring physical hardships, but about mastering the mind's ability to overcome fear and uncertainty. the physical training was also intense. Astrius introduced Thomas to combat techniques that relied on agility and precision rather than raw power. Thomas learned to use his smaller stature to his advantage, employing guerrilla tactics and evasive maneuvers that allowed him to outwit opponents who were physically superior. Despite his progress, Thomas remained an enigma to his peers. The other soldiers viewed his training with skepticism, unable to grasp the value of Astrius's methods. To them, strength was a tangible attribute, muscle and endurance that could be measured and compared. Thomas's efforts seemed inadequate in comparison, a reality that was underscored during physical evaluations where he still lagged behind in raw performance metrics. During one of the evaluations, Thomas was pitted against a seasoned soldier in a combat simulation. The scenario was designed to test endurance and strength, with the combatants battling in a controlled environment that replicated the hostile conditions of Epsilon 7. Thomas's opponent was a formidable figure, their physical prowess a stark contrast to Thomas's more refined approach. The match was brutal. Thomas's movements were fluid and calculated, each action driven by the techniques he had mastered. Yet, despite his skill, he was overpowered by the sheer strength of his opponent. The fight was a testament to the limitations of his current abilities, a sobering reminder that while mental acuity was valuable, it did not always translate into immediate physical dominance. Thomas emerged from the simulation bruised and battered, his sense of achievement tempered by the reality of his limitations. The other soldiers watched with a mixture of pity and derision, their respect for him as a warrior still lacking. He was making progress, but it was not yet enough to bridge the gap between his potential and the expectations placed upon him. As the sun set over the alien landscape, casting long shadows across the scarred terrain, Thomas sat alone on a rocky outcrop. The distant lights of the base flickered in the twilight, a reminder of the civilization he was striving to protect. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds and distant stars, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He looked at the sky, the stars seeming to shimmer with a quiet, indifferent beauty. The vastness of the universe felt both awe-inspiring and indifferent to his struggles. He wondered about the nature of strength and whether it was truly defined by physical ability alone. His training had shown him that strength could be found in the mind and spirit, but convincing others of this truth was a different challenge altogether. The transition from the harsh environment of Epsilon 7 to the complex realities of interstellar warfare loomed large. Thomas knew that his journey was far from over. As he stood up, brushing the dust from his uniform, Thomas felt a renewed sense of determination. He was far from being a perfect soldier, but he was evolving. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was prepared to face them. The true measure of his strength would not be found in the battles he fought or the accolades he received, but in his ability to endure and adapt. The night deepened, and with it, Thomas's resolve solidified. The journey he was on was not just about proving his worth, but about redefining what it meant to be strong. As he prepared for the trials to come, he knew that his path would be one of continual growth and self-discovery. The rise of the weak was not a story of immediate triumph, but of gradual, determined progress in the face of overwhelming odds. The echoes of war drums reverberated through the void as the alien forces gathered, their presence a somber testament to the gravity of the conflict looming on the horizon. Their assembly was a scene of meticulous precision and chilling order, a stark contrast to the chaotic struggle of humanity's own defenses. The alien elite, known as the Trakari, emerged from their ships with a mechanical grace, their armored forms gliding silently across the surface of their command vessel. The vessel itself was a marvel of alien engineering. Its sleek, obsidian hull was dotted with bioluminescent veins that pulsed rhythmically, casting an eerie glow in the vacuum of space. Its surface was covered with complex, shifting patterns that seemed to adapt to the surrounding environment, rendering the craft almost invisible against the backdrop of distant stars. The Trakari were a race of imposing stature, their physical presence both intimidating and awe-inspiring. Each member of their elite forces wore a suit of armor that seemed to be an extension of their very being. The armor was a blend of dark metallic alloys and organic materials, seamlessly integrated to provide both protection and agility. Their helmets, adorned with elaborate engravings and glowing insignias, concealed their features but conveyed an air of unyielding authority. Their culture was one of rigid discipline and ancient traditions, their philosophy deeply rooted in the belief of their own superiority. The Trakari viewed themselves as the rightful rulers of the galaxy, a belief reinforced by their advanced technology and their history of conquest. To them, humanity was a fleeting anomaly, a species that had risen to prominence only to be extinguished by its own inherent weaknesses. In the heart of the Trakari Command Center, a grand hall stretched out in somber grandeur. The walls were lined with screens displaying data streams and strategic maps, their surfaces reflecting the cold light of the command vessel's interior. At the center of this hall stood a raised platform, upon which the Trakari's high command convened. Their leader, known as the Arbiter, was an imposing figure even among their elite ranks. Clad in ceremonial armor adorned with intricate designs and sharp edges, the Arbiter's presence commanded immediate reverence. The Arbiter addressed the assembly with a voice that resonated with both authority and disdain. Our enemies, the humans, have proven to be a persistent irritant. They cling to their fragile existence, oblivious to their impending doom. Today, we shall demonstrate the futility of their defiance. As the Arbiter spoke, projections flickered to life around the hall, displaying images of human colonies, vulnerable outposts scattered across the galaxy. Each image was marked with data on their defenses, population, and strategic importance. The Trakari High Command deliberated with clinical detachment, their discussions a blend of strategic calculations and philosophical justifications for their actions. In contrast to the Trakari's cold efficiency, the human perspective was one of intense vulnerability. Thomas Kincaid, recently assigned to a new unit, had been observing the alien elite from a distance, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily upon him. The Trakari's superiority was evident in every aspect of their being, their physical prowess, their technological advancements, and their unwavering confidence. For Thomas, this display was both inspiring and demoralizing, a reminder of how far humanity had yet to come. The contrast between the Trakari and humanity was stark. Where the Trakari operated with an unyielding sense of purpose, humanity struggled with internal discord and inadequacies. The advanced technology of the Trakari was beyond anything human science could match. Ships that defied conventional physics, weapons that could obliterate entire fleets, and technology that seemed almost to merge with their biology. Thomas's unit had been tasked with the defense of one of humanity's outer colonies, a colony that now seemed more like a vulnerable outpost than a bastion of human resilience. As the Trakari launched their assault, the colony was thrust into a state of chaos. The skies were lit up with the fiery trails of incoming projectiles, and the once serene landscape was transformed into a battlefield. The assault was brutal and efficient. The Trakari's ships descended with a precision that left no room for error, their weapons tearing through the colony's defenses with ruthless effectiveness. The human defenders were overwhelmed by the sheer scale and intensity of the attack. The colony's surface was engulfed in flames and debris, the once bustling infrastructure reduced to smoldering ruins. Amidst the devastation, Thomas could only watch as the scene unfolded. The battle was a grim spectacle, a vivid demonstration of the Trakari's power and humanity's vulnerability. As the colony's defenses crumbled, Thomas was consumed by a profound sense of inadequacy. The sight of the Trakari's disciplined assault, their seemingly invincible forces, and the despair of the human defenders left him grappling with a deep moral question. The question that gnawed at him was not just about survival, but about the worthiness of humanity's existence. The Trakari viewed humanity as inferior, a species that had risen to prominence only to be swept aside by its own weaknesses. In the face of such overwhelming power, Thomas questioned whether humanity deserved to survive. Was there something inherent in the human condition that made them worthy of existence, or was their struggle merely a futile resistance against a superior force? As the battle raged on, Thomas's internal conflict grew more intense. The juxtaposition of the Trakari's unrelenting assault and the crumbling human defenses created a profound sense of existential dread. The colony's fall was not just a military defeat, but a symbol of a larger, more troubling reality, the realization of humanity's fragility in the face of a vast and indifferent universe. As the assault subsided, the remnants of the colony lay in ruins, a somber testament to the Trakari's might and the stark reality of human vulnerability. The once vibrant outpost was now a silent graveyard, its survivors left to face the aftermath of a conflict that seemed to pit their very existence against an insurmountable force. The assault on the colony had begun with a sudden, shattering intensity, shaking the ground beneath Thomas Kincaid's feet. The vast expanse of the colony, once bustling with the hum of daily life, had transformed into a battlefield strewn with rubble and smoldering ruins. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt metal and scorched earth, mingling with the sharp tang of fear and desperation. Thomas's unit, now entrenched in a desperate struggle, faced an enemy whose superiority was apparent in every detail. The alien elite, the Trakari, descended upon the colony with a precision that defied conventional warfare. Their ships, dark and sleek, moved with an almost fluid grace, releasing a barrage of energy beams and missiles that cut through the colony's defenses like a hot knife through butter. The once imposing walls of the human fortifications were rendered impotent against the alien onslaught, crumbling under the relentless assault. The combat sequences were chaotic and brutal. The Trakari's weaponry, a combination of advanced plasma cannons and highly sophisticated energy projectiles, wreaked havoc on the human defenses. Their guns emitted a haunting, pulsating light as they fired, each shot resonating with a deep, guttural sound that seemed to echo across the battlefield. The plasma beams sliced through the air, creating a shimmering trail of destructive energy that incinerated everything in its path. Thomas, thrust into the heart of the battle for the first time, struggled to maintain his composure. His training, unconventional and often questioned by his peers, now seemed like his only lifeline. He had been taught to think beyond brute strength, to rely on strategy, intuition, and adaptability. As he ducked behind a crumbling wall, his mind raced, reflecting on the lessons of his mentor. The alien forces moved with an eerie synchronization, their actions guided by a precision that spoke of centuries of practice and refinement. The Trakari were not merely fighting, they were executing a meticulously planned operation. The battlefield was a landscape of destruction. Buildings that had once stood as symbols of human achievement were now shattered remnants, their skeletal structures jutting out like the bones of a fallen giant. Fires burned unchecked, casting an orange glow across the ruins and illuminating the chaos of the fight. The ground was littered with debris, the remains of both human and alien technology intermingling in a grotesque mosaic of devastation. As the battle raged on, Thomas found himself in the midst of a frantic struggle for survival. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the fragility of his existence. He moved with a calculated urgency, dodging incoming fire and utilizing the remnants of his surroundings for cover. His training had taught him to observe and adapt, skills that now proved invaluable. He used the environment to his advantage, laying traps and creating diversions, his movements guided by a newfound clarity. Despite the chaos, Thomas began to see patterns in the alien assault. The Trakari's discipline was evident in their tactics. They formed tight formations, advanced with coordinated precision, and utilized their superior technology to maintain the upper hand. Thomas, though initially overwhelmed, started to recognize the strategic weaknesses in their approach. His unconventional methods, honed through grueling training, allowed him to exploit these weaknesses and survive amidst the turmoil. In the midst of the carnage, Thomas encountered a moment of profound realization. The battle was not just a fight for survival. It was a reflection of a deeper struggle, one that questioned the value of individual lives in the context of a larger conflict. Each life lost, each moment of despair, seemed to echo a fundamental question about existence and purpose. As he looked around at the faces of his comrades, now etched with the marks of battle and fear, he grappled with the notion of sacrifice and the meaning it held in the grand scheme of the war. The Trakari's relentless assault continued unabated. Their forces moved with an unyielding determination, their actions a testament to their belief in their own supremacy. The human defenders fought valiantly, but the disparity in strength and technology made their efforts seem like a futile resistance against an overwhelming force. The colony, once a beacon of human resilience, was now a somber reminder of the stark reality of their situation. Thomas's unit, though fighting with all their might, was gradually pushed back. The Trakari's superior firepower and tactical acumen took a heavy toll on the human defenders. As the battle reached its zenith, Thomas found himself isolated, his unit scattered amidst the ruins. The chaos of the battlefield had become a disorienting maze, each turn bringing new horrors and challenges. Amidst the frenzy, Thomas's resolve was tested to its limits. He fought with a desperation born of fear and determination, each moment a struggle to stay alive. His unconventional training proved to be a lifeline, allowing him to navigate the chaos with a mixture of ingenuity and instinct. Despite his terror, he clung to the belief that his skills might offer a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. As the battle drew to a close, the situation grew increasingly dire. The Trakari's assault had achieved its objective. The colony was in ruins, its defenses shattered. The human forces, though not defeated entirely, were left in disarray. Thomas, though still alive, found himself captured by the Trakari. The alien elite, with their unmatched strength and precision, had managed to overcome even the most determined of human resistance. The capture was a grim reminder of the stakes of the conflict. Thomas, now in the custody of the Trakari, faced an uncertain future. The brutality of the battle and the loss of his comrades weighed heavily upon him. The question of his own worth and survival took on a new dimension as he faced the reality of captivity. In the aftermath of the battle, the colony lay in ruins, a silent witness to the ferocity of the conflict. The once vibrant outpost was now a desolate landscape, its inhabitants and defenders lost to the ravages of war. The fires continued to burn, casting long shadows across the wreckage, as if mourning the loss of what had once been. Thomas's thoughts were consumed by the magnitude of the conflict and the implications of his capture. The battle had highlighted the disparity between human and alien forces, raising questions about the nature of strength and survival. As he prepared for the next phase of his ordeal, the philosophical weight of his situation pressed heavily upon him. In the cold, metallic confines of the Trakari's detention facility, Thomas Kincaid felt the weight of his captivity pressing down on him. The alien prison was an immense, sprawling complex, a labyrinth of sterile corridors and high-tech containment cells, each as foreboding and impersonal as the last. The walls were made of a shimmering, translucent material that emitted a faint, eerie glow, casting long shadows and making the space seem even more oppressive. The ambient light was dim, filtered through a lattice of strange, bioluminescent panels that provided just enough illumination to reveal the stark, clinical nature of the environment. Thomas's cell was a stark contrast to the once vibrant colony he had fought to protect. Here, there were no comforting sights or sounds, only the harsh, sterile reality of his new existence. The cell was equipped with advanced alien technology, including a force field that flickered with an unsettling hum whenever he approached. The force field was invisible to the naked eye, but for a faint, pulsating distortion in the air, it seemed to absorb and neutralize any attempt at escape with a dispassionate efficiency. He sat on a narrow, metal bench, his reflection distorted by the force field's ripples. The silence was broken only by the occasional hum of machinery or the distant echoes of alien footsteps. The air was cool and dry, tinged with an acrid scent that was foreign and unsettling. The dispassionate environment offered little in the way of comfort or distraction, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. The days bled together in a monotonous haze of introspection and reflection. Thomas found himself grappling with questions of self-worth and purpose that had once seemed abstract. His experiences in the battle and his subsequent captivity forced him to confront the fragility of human life and the vast, indifferent cosmos in which humanity existed. His initial fear and disorientation gave way to a more profound contemplation of his own role and the nature of strength. One evening, as Thomas lay on the cold metal bench, he heard the familiar, rhythmic approach of alien footsteps. The Trakari guards, their forms imposing and devoid of any recognizable emotion, approached his cell. Their presence was both intimidating and alien, their armor reflecting the dim light in a way that made their movements appear almost ghostly. They exchanged clipped, formal statements in their guttural language, their voices echoing off the walls in a low, mechanical cadence. A door in the corridor slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and a figure stepped into view. It was an alien of higher rank, distinguished by ornate armor and a flowing cloak that shimmered with iridescent colors. This Trakari, with eyes like dark voids set against a visage of sharp angles, exuded an aura of authority and cold intellect. He was the first to address Thomas directly since his capture, and his voice carried an unsettling blend of curiosity and detachment. "You are the human who survived the recent conflict," the Trakari said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "It is rare for us to encounter one of your kind with such resilience." Thomas looked up, his expression a mixture of defiance and weariness. "Resilience or merely luck," he replied, his voice rough and strained from the harsh conditions. "What do you want from me?" The alien's gaze was inscrutable. "We are aware of your unorthodox methods of survival. The qualities you possess are of interest to us. You have been given a choice." With that, the Trakari extended a hand, holding a small, sleek device. It was an offer that carried the weight of a profound moral dilemma. The device, a communication tool of some sort, seemed to pulse with a faint, pulsating light. The Trakari's offer was clear: defect to their side, and he would be granted power and prestige beyond his wildest dreams. The prospect was enticing, yet it came at the cost of betraying everything he had ever known. Thomas's thoughts raced as he considered the offer. The temptation of power was considerable, especially given his perceived inadequacies and the constant struggle he faced. The idea of leaving behind the torment of captivity and gaining a new identity was alluring. Yet, deep within, he understood the inherent danger of such a choice. He could sense the profound cost of betraying his own kind and losing his sense of self in the process. His response was measured, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I cannot accept this offer. To join you would be to lose myself, to become something I am not. My worth is not determined by power or position." The Trakari's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps disappointment or contemplation. He withdrew the device and turned away, leaving Thomas alone once more with his thoughts. The silence returned, more profound than before, laden with the weight of his decision. The days that followed were marked by a deeper sense of isolation and introspection. Thomas's refusal of the offer had solidified his sense of purpose, but it also intensified his internal conflict. He was left to grapple with the existential questions that had surfaced during his captivity. What did it mean to be human in the face of such overwhelming adversity? What was the nature of true strength? The alien prison, with its advanced technology and alien architecture, continued to stand as a stark reminder of the vast gulf between human and alien cultures. The technology was beyond anything Thomas had ever imagined: intricate devices that seemed to manipulate time and space, and alien writing etched into the walls that defied human comprehension. Each detail underscored the profound differences between the two species and highlighted the immense challenge humanity faced in its struggle for survival. The relentless focus on survival and reflection began to take its toll on Thomas. He became acutely aware of the fragility of his existence and the ephemeral nature of human life. Each moment of introspection revealed a deeper understanding of himself and his place in the universe. He realized that strength was not merely a matter of physical prowess, but encompassed endurance, resilience, and the will to survive against insurmountable odds. As Thomas continued to ponder his situation, he became increasingly aware of the existential implications of his predicament. His captivity was not just a physical confinement, but a metaphor for the broader struggle humanity faced in the cosmic arena. The battle he had fought, the offer of defection, and the reflections on his own strength all converged into a deeper understanding of the nature of existence and the value of individual lives. The air was electric with tension as Thomas Kincaid prepared for his escape. The alien detention facility, a marvel of advanced engineering and cold, unyielding efficiency, stood silent, its inner mechanisms oblivious to the human resolve brewing within its walls. Thomas's cell, once a prison of despair, now felt like a crucible in which his determination had forged new strength. The escape plan was audacious, born from months of careful observation and meticulous preparation. The alien fortress, a sprawling complex of gleaming metal and shimmering energy fields, was an intricate maze of high-tech corridors and heavily guarded access points. Its architecture was a blend of sharp, angular designs and fluid, organic curves, reflecting an advanced civilization's aesthetic sensibilities. The walls, imbued with a subtle iridescence, seemed to breathe with an almost sentient awareness, adapting to the presence of intruders. Thomas crouched in the shadow of the cell's entrance, his eyes scanning the corridor beyond. The force field had been his first obstacle, a barrier he had studied and observed meticulously. He had noted the patterns of its flickering energy, the intervals at which it weakened. Timing was crucial, and he had spent hours calculating the exact moment when it would be vulnerable. He had fashioned a crude but effective disruptor from scavenged parts, a combination of alien tech and human ingenuity. The device, while rudimentary, was capable of emitting a pulse that interfered with the force field's energy, creating a brief window of opportunity. The moment of truth arrived as the field flickered and wavered, granting him passage. With a deep breath, Thomas slipped through the opening and into the corridor. The hallways were silent, save for the occasional hum of machinery and the distant echoes of alien voices. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline sharpening his senses and focusing his mind. The alien architecture loomed around him, an intricate dance of metallic surfaces and bioluminescent veins, reflecting a civilization far advanced from his own. Thomas moved with purpose, his steps calculated and deliberate. He had studied the patrol patterns of the guards, their movements almost predictable in their precision. Using the shadows and the cover of the architecture, he navigated the corridors, avoiding detection with an almost practiced ease. His unconventional training had prepared him for this moment, and the lessons learned in the alien prison now proved invaluable. The fortress was a labyrinth, but Thomas had committed its layout to memory. He reached a large control room, its entrance guarded by 2 alien sentinels. The room was filled with consoles and screens, each displaying streams of data and surveillance feeds. Thomas's plan hinged on disrupting the fortress's security systems to create a diversion, allowing him to escape amidst the chaos. He approached the control room with caution, slipping past the guards with a mixture of stealth and luck. Inside, he quickly set to work, using his makeshift disruptor to hack into the system. The alien technology was complex, but he had spent enough time analyzing it to exploit its vulnerabilities. The control room erupted into disarray as alarms blared and lights flashed, creating a cacophony of confusion. The diversion was effective. Thomas seized the opportunity, slipping out of the control room and making his way toward the outer perimeter of the fortress. The corridors were now a chaotic blur of flashing lights and scrambling guards. He followed a route he had identified during his captivity, a series of maintenance tunnels that led to the fortress's exterior. The escape was far from smooth. Thomas encountered several close calls, narrowly avoiding patrols and bypassing security measures. The alien fortress, once a symbol of his captivity, was now a treacherous battleground. His heart raced with each narrow escape, the realization of his impending freedom fueling his resolve. Finally, he reached the exterior of the fortress, a vast expanse of alien landscape stretching out before him. The sky above was a tumultuous swirl of colors, a reflection of the strange and hostile world he had come to know. The alien architecture was a stark contrast to the natural landscape, a reminder of the civilization that had held him captive. Thomas took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was free from the fortress, but his escape was far from complete. He had to navigate the treacherous terrain of the alien planet and find a way to survive. The planet was desolate and harsh, its surface a barren wasteland of jagged rocks and swirling dust. The atmosphere was thin and dry, making every breath a labor. Thomas's escape had left him disoriented and exhausted, But he knew that survival depended on his ability to adapt and overcome the challenges of this alien world. He set out across the barren landscape, using his training to navigate the hostile environment. The harsh terrain was a test of his endurance and resourcefulness, demanding every ounce of his strength and ingenuity. The alien sky, with its swirling hues and shifting patterns, cast an eerie glow over the desolation, making the landscape seem even more alien and inhospitable. As Thomas traveled, he encountered the remnants of previous battles, wreckage and debris scattered across the desolate plain. The evidence of conflict was a stark reminder of the war that raged between humanity and the alien forces. The landscape was scarred and marked by the brutal reality of the conflict, a testament to the cost of survival and the relentless nature of war. The journey was a grueling one, marked by periods of intense physical exertion and moments of introspective reflection. Thomas's thoughts were consumed by the philosophical question of freedom and sacrifice. What was freedom worth in the grand scheme of existence? How far was he willing to go to secure his own survival and the survival of his species? The harsh environment tested his resolve, pushing him to his limits. Each step was a struggle, and every obstacle seemed to defy his efforts. Yet, amidst the adversity, Thomas began to see a different perspective. The desolation of the planet, the stark contrast between his previous confinement and his current struggle, forced him to confront the nature of his own freedom. The escape from the alien fortress had been a triumph of human ingenuity and determination, but it had also highlighted the profound challenges that lay ahead. Thomas's journey was far from over, and the path to survival was fraught with difficulties. Yet, the experience had also deepened his understanding of the nature of freedom and the sacrifices required to achieve it. As Thomas pressed on through the hostile terrain, he found a small, sheltered area amidst the rocks, an opportunity for rest and reflection. The harshness of the environment, the isolation, and the weight of his experiences had all contributed to a newfound perspective on his own strength and the nature of survival. The transition from captivity to freedom was a profound journey, marked by physical and emotional challenges. As he settled into the makeshift shelter, Thomas's thoughts turned to the future. The escape had been a significant step, but it was only the beginning of a new phase in his journey. The harsh environment of the alien planet would test his resolve, but it would also provide an opportunity for growth and understanding. The struggles ahead would be formidable, but Thomas was determined to face them with the same courage and resilience that had seen him through his captivity. Thomas Kincaid sat motionless beneath the jagged overhang of the rocky outcrop, his chest rising and falling with the deep, controlled breaths of a man on the edge of exhaustion. The escape from the alien fortress was behind him, but in its place stood the vast, hostile expanse of an alien world, its sky a swirl of foreign colors, its landscape as barren and treacherous as the void itself. Here, there were no walls, no guards, no force fields to contain him, only the silence of solitude, broken occasionally by the howl of wind or the distant growl of creatures lurking just out of sight. The initial rush of freedom had worn off quickly. With each passing hour, the reality of his situation bore down on him, as oppressive as the cold wind that whipped across the desolate plain. There was no clear direction, no signs of life, or, at least, none that seemed friendly. He was alone. The knowledge of it sank deeper into his bones with each breath. Thomas surveyed his surroundings, eyes scanning the endless horizon. The alien planet was unlike anything he had ever seen, a place where the land itself seemed to resist life. Jagged rock formations jutted up from the ground like the teeth of some ancient, long-dead beast. The earth beneath him was dry, cracked, and lifeless, save for the occasional twisted plant or scattered remnants of battle wreckage. He recognized none of it. The escape had landed him in a place that felt more like purgatory than freedom. The terrain was merciless, uneven, treacherous, and stretching out for miles without any hint of shelter or water. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever dangers might be stalking him. But his body ached, muscles sore from days of physical and mental strain. Rest wasn't just an option. It was a necessity if he wanted to survive long enough to find any semblance of help, if there even was help to be found. The question gnawed at him. Would anyone even be looking for me? He had spent weeks in the alien fortress, cut off from the rest of humanity, from any hope of rescue. The thought of sending a signal had crossed his mind more than once since his escape, but it carried a grave risk. A signal might reach human forces if they were still out there, but it could just as easily draw the attention of the alien elites, the very beings he had narrowly escaped. And in a place as desolate and hostile as this, attracting the wrong kind of attention would be a death sentence. Still, he couldn't afford to linger in indecision. His supplies were non-existent, and the planet's harsh conditions were an enemy of their own. The thin atmosphere was barely breathable, each inhalation shallow and unsatisfying, while the planet's gravity, though familiar, had a subtle heaviness to it that wore on him over time. He was running on borrowed time. The landscape ahead beckoned with its mix of foreboding and opportunity. In the distance, he could make out a series of cliffs, dark, towering monoliths that might provide some semblance of shelter from the elements. He would head in that direction, he decided. Perhaps from there, he could find a vantage point to reassess his next move, to plot a course of survival in this unforgiving world. But as he rose to his feet, something shifted deep inside him, an unease that had nothing to do with the harsh environment. Fear and loneliness gnawed at him, creeping into the corners of his mind like an unseen predator. The solitude was different here. It wasn't the kind of isolation he had known before, when he had been locked in a cell with only his thoughts to keep him company. Here, there was no certainty, no walls to mark the boundaries of his existence. Here, the vastness stretched out in every direction, indifferent to his presence, and for the first time, he truly felt the weight of being alone. Thomas wasn't used to relying on anyone but himself. Years of military training had drilled into him the importance of independence, of trusting in his own capabilities. But this was something else. This was survival in its purest form, a test of endurance not just against the physical challenges of the alien planet, but against the psychological toll of being utterly alone in an environment that seemed designed to kill him. With each step he took toward the distant cliffs, the landscape seemed to shift beneath his feet, the alien terrain refusing to give him any comfort or reprieve. The rocky ground crunched under his boots, the sharp edges digging into the soles like tiny needles. His legs burned with fatigue, but he pushed on, focusing on the rhythm of his movement, one foot in front of the other. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a low, mournful sound, a kind of wail that echoed across the barren plain. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing but the same desolate landscape. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, crawling along his spine like an itch he couldn't scratch. The cliffs loomed closer now, their dark stone faces weathered and scarred by time and elements. As he neared them, Thomas began to notice strange markings etched into the rock, patterns that didn't appear to be natural. Symbols, perhaps, or remnants of a long-forgotten civilization. He traced his fingers along the grooves, feeling the rough texture beneath his skin, trying to make sense of their meaning. But there was no time to linger. Nightfall was approaching, and with it, the temperature would plummet. He needed to find shelter before the cold became another enemy. He found a small alcove near the base of the cliffs, a shallow depression in the rock that provided some protection from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Thomas settled in, wrapping his arms around his knees and pulling his jacket tight against his body. The temperature was already dropping, the cold seeping into his bones. For a while, he just sat there, staring out at the alien landscape, his mind wandering to the people he had left behind, the world he had known before all of this. Was anyone even aware of his disappearance? Were they still fighting, still holding out against the alien forces that had captured him? Or had they moved on, assuming him dead, just another casualty of the war? The questions weighed heavy on him, but there were no answers to be found here, only silence and the endless horizon. He was alone, and if he didn't act soon, he would die here, alone, forgotten, lost on a planet that didn't care. Freedom. The word echoed in his mind, taunting him. He had escaped the fortress, yes, but was this really freedom? Was it worth the cost if it meant dying here? without ever seeing another human face again? As the last rays of light disappeared behind the distant hills, Thomas made his decision. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The planet was too hostile, the risks too great. If he wanted to survive, he needed to send a signal, no matter what it might attract. He reached into his pack and pulled out the small, makeshift transponder he had managed to cobble together from scavenged parts. It wasn't much, but it would do the job. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the activation switch. This was the moment of truth. Once the signal went out, there would be no turning back. But what choice did he have? The alien fortress had been a prison, yes, but this place, this desolate world, it was just as much of a prison, albeit a more open one. He couldn't stay here, waiting for death to claim him. He had to take the chance, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Thomas pressed the switch. A low hum filled the air as the transponder came to life, its signal broadcasting into the vastness of space. He didn't know who would hear it, if anyone, but the message was clear. He needed help. Whether that help would come from friend or foe remained to be seen. As the signal pulsed into the night, Thomas leaned back against the cold stone, his eyes scanning the darkened sky. The stars above were unfamiliar, distant and cold, just like the world beneath his feet. He was alone, yes, but for the first time since his escape, he felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, a spark in the darkness. The waiting began. Would help come? Would the signal be his salvation or his undoing? Thomas didn't have the answers, but as he sat there, listening to the hum of the transponder, he knew that, one way or another, his fate was now in the hands of the universe. The cold night air wrapped around him like a shroud, but inside, a fire had been lit, a determination to survive, to fight, no matter what came next. For now, all he could do was wait. The faint hum of the transponder persisted through the cold night air, pulsing every few minutes like a heartbeat in the vast, indifferent silence. Thomas lay motionless against the rough stone, eyes fixed on the sky, watching for any sign of movement. The alien world stretched out before him, empty and still, offering no reassurance that anyone or anything had received his desperate signal. For hours, nothing changed. The oppressive stillness weighed on him, and every now and then, the loneliness crept in like a shadow. He fought it off by focusing on the landscape around him, memorizing the patterns in the rock formations, listening to the soft rush of wind as it moved across the alien plains. His mind wandered, grappling with the knowledge that his future rested in the hands of whoever, or whatever, might respond to his call. As time dragged on, doubt began to gnaw at him. Had he made the right choice? Should he have waited, or tried to find another way? It was too late to reconsider now. The signal was out, and all he could do was wait for the consequences. It wasn't until just before dawn that something changed. A low, mechanical hum cut through the air, faint at first but growing louder by the second. Thomas sat up, heart pounding in his chest as his eyes scanned the horizon. At first, he saw nothing, but then, just as the first rays of light began to crest over the distant hills, a shape appeared. A ship. It was unlike the alien vessels he had encountered before, sleek, angular, and unmistakably human. It moved with precision, gliding effortlessly across the barren landscape, its engines barely audible over the whistling wind. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the ship descended, coming to rest a few hundred meters from his makeshift camp. Dust and debris swirled around it as its landing gear deployed, settling into the cracked earth. For a moment, Thomas didn't move. His body was frozen, torn between relief and fear. He had signaled for help, but this was more than he had expected. Whoever they were, they had found him, and now he had to face the reality of what came next. The ramp of the ship lowered with a soft hiss, and a group of figures emerged, 5 of them, clad in advanced, matte black armor that gleamed under the rising sun. Their movements were precise, calculated. Even from this distance, Thomas could tell they were no ordinary soldiers. This was a strike team, elite, specialized, and clearly on a mission. The lead figure approached first, their helmet reflective and featureless, giving Thomas no indication of who or what was behind it. They stopped a few meters away, the rest of the team fanning out around them, weapons at the ready but not aimed. Yet, Thomas stood slowly, keeping his hands visible, his body tense but controlled. He wasn't sure what kind of greeting to expect, but he knew one thing for certain. Trust wasn't something that would come easily here. "Thomas Kincaid?" The voice was muffled, distorted slightly by the helmet's comm system, but unmistakably human. He nodded, his throat dry. "That's me." There was a pause, a moment of silence as the lead figure sized him up. Then, without another word, they reached up and unlatched their helmet, pulling it off to reveal a woman's face, sharp, angular features framed by short, dark hair. Her eyes were piercing, calculating, and as they locked onto his, Thomas could feel the weight of her scrutiny. "Captain Elise Varga," she said, her voice now clear and authoritative. "You've been off the grid for weeks. How the hell are you still alive?" It wasn't an accusation, exactly, but there was suspicion in her tone. Thomas could feel it, an undercurrent of doubt, of distrust. To them, his survival here must have seemed impossible, and in a way, it was. He had escaped by luck as much as by skill, and now he had to prove that he was worth the effort they had put into finding him. "I managed to escape," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Got out of the fortress a few days ago, ended up here. Been trying to stay alive since." Varga raised an eyebrow, glancing at the rest of her team. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down the side of his neck, gave a slight nod, but the others remained silent, their faces hidden behind their helmets. "And the aliens?" she asked. "The ones who captured you?" "Dead," Thomas replied. "At least the ones I ran into. I don't know if they're still looking for me, but I couldn't stay in one place any longer." Another pause. Varga's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if she were weighing his words, trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said, "we'll take you back to the fleet. But understand this, you're not in the clear yet. We've got questions, and you're going to answer every single one of them." Thomas swallowed hard, nodding. He had expected this. There was no way they would just accept his story at face value. But the fact that they were willing to take him back was a start. It meant they hadn't written him off completely. Yet, Varga motioned for him to follow, and the team fell into formation around him as they made their way back to the ship. Thomas couldn't help but notice the fluidity of their movements, the way they communicated with subtle gestures and barely audible clicks over their comms. They were well trained, far beyond the standard military units he had served with. These were the best of the best, sent in for the most dangerous and sensitive missions. The fact that they had been dispatched to retrieve him only added to the growing unease in his gut. As they approached the ship, one of the soldiers, a smaller figure with a lithe build, gave him a glance, their helmet tilting slightly as if they were studying him. Thomas caught a glimpse of their visor, reflecting the landscape around them in a distorted sheen. There was something unsettling about it. The way they moved without speaking, the way their presence seemed to dominate the space around them. He wasn't sure if it was admiration or fear he felt, but he knew one thing: he was out of his depth here. Once aboard, the strike team wasted no time. They secured him in one of the rear compartments, away from the main controls and the rest of the crew. The ship's interior was stark and efficient, every surface gleaming with a cold, metallic sheen of advanced human technology. Thomas couldn't help but marvel at it. This was the cutting edge of humanity's military might, the kind of equipment he had only heard about in passing, whispered among the ranks of soldiers who dreamed of serving in such elite units. But as the ship lifted off, the engines rumbling softly beneath his feet, Thomas's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this mission, his retrieval, wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Why had they come for him? What did they know that he didn't? The flight back to the fleet was uneventful, the ship's systems working seamlessly as they crossed the alien landscape and ascended into orbit. Thomas sat in silence, his thoughts racing. The strike team remained distant, their attention focused on their instruments and displays. There was no conversation, no explanation of what was to come. only the steady hum of the ship's engines and the occasional beep of a console. As they approached the human fleet, Thomas caught his first glimpse of it through the small viewport in the rear compartment. Massive ships, larger than anything he had ever seen, hung in the void like silent sentinels. Their sleek, angular designs were a testament to humanity's technological prowess, each one bristling with weaponry and defenses. It was a sight that should have filled him with awe, but instead, it only deepened the sense of unease that had been growing inside him since the strike team's arrival. Once they docked, Thomas was escorted off the ship and into the heart of the fleet's command center. The corridors were wide and spotless, filled with personnel moving with purpose. But even here, among his own people, Thomas felt the weight of suspicion. Eyes followed him as he passed, and whispers trailed in his wake. He was taken to a debriefing room, sterile, cold, with nothing but a metal table and 2 chairs. Vargas stood in the doorway, watching as he sat down. "You'll wait here," she said, her voice flat. "They'll want answers. Be ready to give them." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure what answers he even had to give. His survival had been a mix of luck, instinct, and desperation, but he knew that wouldn't satisfy the questions that were coming. They wanted something more, something deeper, and he wasn't sure he had it. As the door slid shut behind her, Thomas was left alone once again. But this time, the solitude didn't feel like the same oppressive force it had on the alien planet. Here, in the heart of humanity's fleet, it felt different. It felt like he was on the edge of something larger, something he didn't yet understand. The unease settled deep in his gut. This was just the beginning. Thomas sat in the sterile debriefing room, the cool metal of the chair pressing against his back. He had spent hours there, waiting, thinking, and replaying the events that had brought him to this moment. Every choice, every misstep, every desperate struggle to survive played in his mind like a broken film reel. The strike team had done their part, delivering him back to the fleet without a word of explanation, but now he was left to face what came next. Whatever that was. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the ventilation system. The longer Thomas sat, the more the weight of his situation pressed down on him. He was no longer a simple soldier lost behind enemy lines. He had become something more. A loose end, perhaps, or maybe a pawn in a much larger game he didn't yet understand. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Thomas straightened in his seat. A figure entered, their crisp military uniform bearing the insignia of high command. This wasn't a casual visit. The officer's face was stern, unreadable, and Thomas could feel the authority radiating from them even before they spoke. "Lieutenant Kincaid," the officer began, their voice cool and measured. "We've been monitoring your situation closely." Thomas remained silent, unsure of how much to say or how much was already known. The officer took a seat across from him, folding their hands neatly on the table. "Your survival behind enemy lines has raised questions," they continued. "There are those who wonder how you managed to evade capture for so long, how you escaped. But that's not what we're here to discuss today." Thomas felt a tension in the air, a weight behind the officer's words. He could tell this was leading somewhere, but he wasn't sure where yet. "You've proven resourceful," the officer said, their eyes narrowing slightly as they assessed him. "And that hasn't gone unnoticed. We need soldiers like you. People who can adapt, who can survive when the odds are against them. You may not have the same combat prowess as the elites, but there's something else about you. Something that makes you useful." Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, the discomfort growing. He had always been aware that he wasn't the strongest, the fastest, or the most skilled among the soldiers. He had survived by sheer willpower and instinct, not by mastery of his craft. But now, it seemed that very thing was being turned into an asset. The officer leaned forward, their gaze intense. "We're in the midst of a war that will decide the fate of humanity, Lieutenant. The aliens are relentless, their forces overwhelming. Our survival depends not just on our strength, but on our ability to adapt, to outthink them. And that's where you come in." A pause hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. "We're offering you a new mission," the officer said. one that will take you back into enemy territory. But this time, it's different. You won't be a lone survivor. You'll be part of something much larger, something that could tip the scales in this war. The fate of humanity might well depend on it. Thomas blinked, his mind racing. This was what he had feared. They were sending him back. But at the same time, there was something else, an undercurrent of opportunity, a chance to make a real difference, to prove that he wasn't just the weakest soldier, the one barely scraping by. He could feel the shift inside himself, the beginnings of something like purpose. He straightened his posture. "What's the mission?" The officer's expression didn't change, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in their eyes, as if they had expected him to ask this very question. "We've uncovered intelligence that suggests the aliens are preparing for a final assault, one that could wipe out our remaining forces," the officer explained. "But we've also identified a weakness. Deep within their command structure, there's a group, an elite faction, that controls the strategic decisions of their entire military operation. If we can disrupt them, throw their plans into chaos, we may have a chance to stop the invasion before it reaches our homeworlds." Thomas could feel the gravity of the words. This wasn't just a mission, it was the mission, the one that would decide everything, and they were asking him to be a part of it. "The catch is this," the officer continued. "This mission will take you deep into alien territory. You'll be embedded with a team, but you'll have to rely on your instincts and resourcefulness to navigate the situation. We need someone who can think on their feet, someone who's proven they can survive when everything falls apart." The officer's eyes locked onto his, and Thomas felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, about whether or not he could live up to the potential they saw in him. "Do you accept?" the officer asked, their tone final, as if there were no other option. Thomas hesitated for only a moment. He had spent weeks on the run, fighting for his life with no end in sight. He had faced death more times than he could count, and somehow he had come through it. This was different. This was a chance to take control of his fate, to be more than just a survivor. "I accept," he said, the words firm, resolute. The officer nodded, standing from the table. "Good. You'll be briefed further once you're on board the command ship. Prepare yourself, Lieutenant. The next few days will determine everything." With that, the officer turned and left the room, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. As the door slid shut behind them, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. There was fear, of course, the knowledge that he was being sent back into danger, that he would be facing the very enemy that had nearly broken him. But there was also something else, a sense of purpose, a sense that, for the first time, he was part of something larger than himself. The command ship was a marvel of human engineering, sleek, efficient, bristling with the latest in military technology. As Thomas boarded, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the scale of it. The corridors were wide and filled with personnel, all moving with a kind of disciplined precision that came from years of training and experience. This was humanity's best, the core of their military might. He was led to the mission briefing room, where a small group of high-ranking officers waited. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the war pressing down on everyone in the room. A holographic map of the galaxy hovered in the center, displaying key points of conflict and strategic positions. Thomas stood at attention, waiting for the briefing to begin. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran with scars lining his face, stepped forward. His voice was rough, but commanding. "Lieutenant Kincaid, you've been chosen for this mission because you've proven yourself under extreme conditions. You survived where others would have fallen. That makes you an asset to us." The map shifted, zooming in on a region of space Thomas recognized as alien-controlled territory. "Our intelligence suggests that this region is home to the alien elite forces, the ones responsible for coordinating their attacks. They're well protected, but we believe they're also vulnerable. If we can take them out, we can destabilize their entire military structure." The officer's gaze hardened. "This is where you come in. You'll be embedded with a team of specialists, but your role is crucial. You've been there. You've seen how they operate, We need your insight, your instincts, to help us navigate the situation." Thomas nodded, absorbing the information. He understood now why they had chosen him. His survival wasn't just luck, it was experience. He had been in the thick of it, and that made him valuable. The officer continued, laying out the specifics of the mission. They would infiltrate the alien stronghold, gather intelligence, and strike at the heart of their command. It was a dangerous, high-stakes operation, but the reward was clear. If they succeeded, humanity might have a fighting chance. As the briefing concluded, Thomas felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was tempered by the knowledge that he had a purpose now. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. That night, as Thomas lay in his quarters, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't help but think about the road that had led him here. From the weakest soldier, struggling to survive behind enemy lines, to being chosen for a mission that could change the course of the war. It was a strange feeling, knowing that so much now rested on his shoulders. But as he thought about the mission ahead, about the team he would be working with, and the stakes they faced, he realized something. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first set foot on that alien planet. He had grown, changed. He had faced death and come through the other side, and now he was ready to face whatever came next. As he drifted off to sleep, one question lingered in his mind, echoing through the quiet darkness. What did it mean to be chosen? Was it fate, destiny, or simply a matter of circumstance? And did it even matter, as long as you made the choice to fight? Whatever the answer was, Thomas knew one thing for certain: he was ready. Ready to face the alien elites once more. Ready to fight for humanity's survival. The silence before the storm was unbearable. Even on the bridge of the command ship, where the air was filled with the low hum of machinery and the whispered exchanges of the crew, there was a tension that pressed down like the weight of a world. Thomas Kincaid, once the weakest among them, stood at the center of it all, his eyes fixed on the holographic display that projected the vastness of space before him. The stars seemed distant, almost indifferent to the chaos that was about to unfold. Humanity's forces were assembled. Fleets of ships, each one a testament to human ingenuity and desperation, hovered in formation, waiting for the command to engage. Beyond them, the alien armada loomed, a wall of darkness that stretched across the horizon like a living thing. This was it, the final stand. There would be no retreat, no second chances, victory or extinction. Thomas clenched his fists, feeling the cool metal of his exosuit against his skin. It had been weeks since he'd been thrust into this role, weeks since he had accepted the mission that would place him at the center of humanity's fight for survival. He had grown, changed in ways he never thought possible. Gone was the uncertain soldier who had barely survived behind enemy lines. In his place stood a leader, one who had faced death and emerged stronger for it. But as he stared into the void, Thomas couldn't shake the doubt that gnawed at him. Was this what victory looked like? Was this what they were fighting for, a galaxy torn apart by war, by hate, by fear? He had seen too much, lost too much, to believe that survival alone was enough. A voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "Lieutenant Kincaid, the fleet is ready. We're awaiting your orders." He turned to face the speaker, a young officer whose face was pale with tension. She couldn't have been more than 25, barely old enough to remember the beginning of the war. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and determination, the same look he had seen in so many others. They were all clinging to the hope that somehow, against all odds, they could win this fight. Thomas nodded, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Signal the fleet. We move on my command." The officer saluted and moved to relay the order, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts once more. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed. He thought of those they had lost along the way. Faces flashed through his mind, comrades, friends, people who had once stood by his side, but were now nothing more than memories. Some had fallen in battle, others to the slow grind of despair that came with fighting a war with no end in sight. And then there was her. Alara. The thought of her hit him like a physical blow. She had been his anchor, his light in the darkness. But she was gone now, lost to the cruelty of war. Thomas could still see her face, could still hear her voice in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to remember. She had believed in him, believed that he could be more than just another soldier. And now, standing on the precipice of the final battle, he wanted to prove her right. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself that brief flicker of vulnerability. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it aside. There was no room for hesitation, no room for doubt. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. The communications console beeped, and Thomas opened his eyes. The fleet was ready. "Prepare to engage," he said, his voice calm and steady. "All units, focus fire on the alien command ships. We cut off their head, and the rest will fall." A flurry of activity erupted on the bridge as the orders were relayed. Thomas watched as the human fleet surged forward, engines flaring to life as they moved into attack formation. The alien ships responded in kind, their sleek, dark forms cutting through space like predators stalking their prey. The first volley of weapons fire lit up the void, brilliant flashes of light that streaked across the distance between the two forces. Explosions erupted as ships on both sides were torn apart, their debris spiraling into the darkness. The battle had begun. The command ship shuddered under the impact of alien fire, the deck vibrating beneath Thomas's feet. He braced himself against the control console, his eyes locked on the tactical display. The alien forces were relentless, their ships moving with a precision that bordered on terrifying. For every alien vessel they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. "We're losing ships on the left flank," one of the officers called out, panic creeping into their voice. "If we don't reinforce, they'll break through." Thomas scanned the display, his mind racing. The aliens were pushing them to the brink, but there was a pattern to their movements, a method to their madness. They were trying to herd the human fleet, to corral them into a kill zone where they could be picked off one by one. "Pull back the left flank," Thomas ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let them advance. Then hit them with everything we've got. We'll funnel them into the center and trap them." The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded and relayed the order. It was a gamble, but it was the only play they had left. If they could lure the aliens in, they might be able to turn the tide of the battle. Minutes passed in a blur of activity as the fleet adjusted its formation, falling back just enough to entice the alien forces to push forward. The enemy took the bait, their ships surging ahead in pursuit of the retreating human vessels. "Now," Thomas shouted. The fleet opened fire, unleashing a barrage of weapons fire that tore through the alien ranks. Explosions lit up the void, and for the first time, the alien advance faltered. Thomas felt a surge of hope, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The battle was far from over. As the two fleets clashed, Thomas found himself drawn into the rhythm of the fight. Every decision, every order he gave felt like an extension of himself. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was part of something larger, something that went beyond the individual. This was what it meant to fight for humanity, to stand at the edge of oblivion and refuse to back down. But even as they gained ground, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The alien forces were adapting too quickly, their movements becoming more coordinated, more precise. It was as if they were anticipating his every move. And then he saw it. On the far edge of the tactical display, hidden among the chaos of the battle, a single alien ship stood out. It was larger than the others, its sleek form bristling with weapons and shields. But it wasn't its size that caught Thomas's attention, it was the energy readings. The ship was emitting a massive power signature, one that was growing stronger by the second. "They're charging something," Thomas muttered under his breath. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The aliens weren't just fighting to win, they were preparing for something bigger, something catastrophic. "We need to take out that ship," Thomas said, his voice tight with urgency. "If they finish charging that weapon, it's over." The officers on the bridge exchanged nervous glances, but no one questioned his orders. They had seen enough of the alien tactics to know that Thomas was right. "All units, focus fire on the command ship," Thomas ordered. "We take it down now, or we're finished." The fleet shifted its focus, directing its firepower toward the alien command ship. But the vessel's shields held strong, absorbing the barrage with ease. Thomas watched in frustration as their attacks barely made a dent in its defenses. "Lieutenant, the weapon is almost fully charged," one of the officers warned. "We're running out of time." Thomas's mind raced. They needed more firepower, something strong enough to punch through the alien shields. But there was nothing left. The fleet had already given everything they had. Except... Thomas's eyes narrowed as a plan began to form in his mind. It was reckless, dangerous, and more likely than not, suicidal. But it was their only chance. "Prepare the command ship's main cannon," he said, his voice grim. "We're going to ram it." The officers stared at him in shock, disbelief written on their faces. But Thomas didn't waver. He knew what needed to be done. "We're out of options," he said, his voice steady. "If we don't stop that ship, everything we've fought for is lost." There was a long, tense silence as the officers processed his words. Then, one by one, they nodded. The command ship's engines roared to life, and Thomas felt the deck shift beneath his feet as the massive vessel accelerated toward the alien command ship. The distance between the two ships closed rapidly, and for a brief moment, Thomas allowed himself to believe that they might actually succeed. And then, with a deafening explosion, the two ships collided. Thomas awoke to the sound of alarms blaring in his ears. His vision swam as he struggled to focus, pain radiating through his body. The command ship was in ruins, debris scattered around him like the aftermath of a storm. Sparks flew from broken consoles, and the air was thick with smoke. But they had done it. Through the haze of pain and confusion, Thomas could see the alien command ship, or what was left of it. The collision had torn through its hull, and its once impenetrable shields were gone. The weapon they had been charging lay dormant, its power drained. But the victory was hollow. As Thomas looked around the shattered remains of the bridge, he saw the faces of those who had fought beside him, their bodies still and lifeless. The cost had been too high. Thomas staggered to his feet, the weight of his exosuit pressing down on his shoulders like an iron shroud. His body ached with every movement, bruised and battered from the impact of the collision, but he was alive. Around him, the bridge of the command ship was a graveyard. The officers who had once stood beside him, who had trusted him with their lives, lay motionless amidst the twisted metal and flickering displays. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning electronics and the faint metallic tang of blood. He wiped his brow, his hand coming away smeared with grime and sweat. There was no time for grief, no time to reflect on the lives that had been lost. The battle outside still raged, and humanity's survival depended on him. He stumbled toward the nearest console, hoping against hope that some part of the command ship's systems still functioned. The screen flickered to life, its cracked surface barely holding an image. The alien command ship, their greatest threat, was dead in the water. Its dark hull, once sleek and menacing, was now little more than a lifeless hulk drifting in space. They had done it. But at what cost? The answer was immediate and overwhelming as his gaze shifted to the tactical display. The human fleet was in tatters. What had once been a formidable force, a symbol of defiance against impossible odds, was now a scattered collection of broken ships and dying signals. The alien fleet, though diminished, still held the advantage. They hadn't retreated. They were regrouping. Thomas felt a surge of anger rise within him, hot and suffocating. How could it have come to this? After everything they had sacrificed, everything they had fought for, the aliens still pressed on. Victory felt hollow. The promise of survival now seemed like a fleeting dream, slipping through his fingers. A voice crackled through the static of the comm system, weak but unmistakable. "Command? Anyone. Please respond." Thomas fumbled with the controls, his hands shaking as he adjusted the frequency. "This is Lieutenant Kincaid." "Who is this?" "Lieutenant, it's Captain Reyes. We're still holding on. But the fleet's in bad shape. Half of our ships are gone, and the rest. We can't hold much longer." Thomas's heart sank. Reyes was one of the most experienced commanders in the fleet, a man who had survived countless battles and always found a way to pull through. If he was saying they couldn't hold, then it was worse than Thomas had feared. "Understood, Captain," Thomas replied, his voice grim. "Get your people to form up. We'll regroup at the fallback point. We're not done yet." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the static filling the silence like a heavy cloud. "Fallback, sir? There's nowhere to fall back to. Earth is gone. Mars, gone. We're fighting with everything we have, but there's nothing left to defend." Thomas's grip tightened on the console, his knuckles white. He knew it was true. Earth had been reduced to ash long ago, the cradle of humanity shattered by the alien invasion. Every planet, every colony they had tried to defend had been systematically wiped out. All that remained was the fleet, the last vestiges of a dying species fighting a war they had no hope of winning. But he couldn't accept that. Not yet. "Then we fight here," Thomas said, his voice firm despite the weight of despair pressing down on him. "We hold the line, no matter what. We don't give them the satisfaction of finishing us off." There was another long pause before Reyes responded, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Understood, Lieutenant. We'll fight to the end." Thomas cut the comm and leaned heavily against the console, his mind racing. He couldn't let it end like this. There had to be something, some way to turn the tide. His eyes drifted to the holographic display of the battlefield, and he noticed something. A faint signal, barely visible amidst the chaos. It was coming from the wreckage of the alien command ship. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. He keyed in the coordinates and zoomed in on the signal. It was weak, almost non-existent, but it was there, a power signature, unlike anything he had seen before. Whatever it was still operational, still alive. Thomas's thoughts raced. The alien command ship had been the heart of their fleet, the source of their power. If there was something left inside, something they hadn't destroyed, it could be the key to turning the battle in their favor. But it also meant facing whatever was left of the alien leadership, something far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. He didn't have a choice. Summoning the last of his strength, Thomas activated the emergency override on the ship's systems, rerouting power to the hangar bay. His exosuit's thrusters hummed to life as he made his way through the corridors, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the dying ship. He passed the bodies of fallen crew members, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and pain. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The hangar bay was a mess of wreckage and debris, but his ship, a small assault craft designed for infiltration, was still intact. He climbed aboard, the cockpit systems flickering as he powered up the engines. The ship shuddered to life, and Thomas guided it out of the hangar and into the void, toward the alien command ship. As he approached, the enormity of the alien vessel became apparent. Even in its ruined state, it was a massive construct, dwarfing anything humanity had ever built. Its hull was scarred and blackened from the battle, but there was an eerie beauty to it, a cold, dark elegance that spoke of an intelligence far beyond human understanding. Thomas's sensors picked up a weak energy signature coming from deep within the ship's core. He maneuvered his craft through the wreckage, avoiding the jagged remains of the outer hull. The closer he got, the stronger the signal became. It was alive, whatever it was, and it was calling to him. He found an entry point near the ship's central structure and docked, sealing his suit's helmet as he stepped into the alien vessel. The air inside was thin and cold, the lights flickering sporadically as the ship's systems struggled to stay online. The corridors were vast, their walls covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. There was no sign of the crew, no bodies, no movement. It was as if the ship had been abandoned. But Thomas knew better. The aliens were still here, somewhere. He moved cautiously through the corridors, his weapon at the ready. Every step echoed in the emptiness, the sound unnerving in the vast silence. The deeper he went, the stronger the pull became, like a faint whisper at the edge of his mind. It was guiding him, leading him toward the heart of the ship. After what felt like an eternity, he reached a massive chamber at the center of the vessel. The walls were lined with strange machines, their purpose unknown, but at the center of the room stood a single, towering structure. It was a sphere, pulsing with an otherworldly light, suspended in mid-air by invisible forces. The energy signature was coming from within. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever this thing was, it was the source of the power he had detected. It was the key to the aliens' strength, the reason they had been able to wage war on humanity for so long. But what was it? As he stepped closer, the light from the sphere intensified, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with energy. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, resonant hum that resonated with something primal within him. It was as if the sphere was alive, aware of his presence. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and guttural, speaking in a language Thomas couldn't understand. But the meaning was clear. It was a warning. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over his weapon. This was it, the final confrontation. Whatever was inside that sphere, it held the answers he had been searching for. But it also held the power to destroy him, to destroy everything he had fought for. With a deep breath, he reached out and touched the surface of the sphere. The world around him dissolved in an instant, replaced by a blinding light that engulfed his senses. For a moment, Thomas thought he had died, that the sphere had vaporized him the moment he made contact. But then, slowly, the light began to fade, and he found himself standing in a different place. It was a city, massive, sprawling, and ancient beyond comprehension. Towering structures stretched into the sky, their architecture unlike anything he had ever seen. The air was thick with the hum of energy, and strange, floating machines moved silently through the streets. There were no people, no signs of life, but the city was alive with the same pulsating energy he had felt in the sphere. And at the center of it all stood a figure. It was humanoid, tall and slender, its skin a pale, almost translucent white. Its eyes were dark and deep, pools of infinite knowledge that seemed to pierce through Thomas's soul. The figure regarded him with a calm, almost detached curiosity, as if it were studying him. "You are not one of us," the figure said, its voice smooth and melodic. "Yet you have come here. Why?" Thomas struggled to find his voice, his mind reeling from the surreal nature of the encounter. "I came to stop you, to end this war." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. "This war is beyond you. It is beyond your people. You are but a fleeting moment in the vast expanse of time." Thomas clenched his fists, anger rising within him. "You don't get to decide that. We have the right to survive, to fight for our future." The figure's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in its tone. "Survival? Is that what you believe this is about?" Thomas frowned, unsure of what the figure was getting at. What else could it be? The figure took a step closer, its gaze never leaving Thomas's. "You fight for survival, but what have you truly gained? Your world is gone. Your people are scattered, broken. Even if you win this battle, what will remain of your species? What will you have left to fight for?" The words cut deep, striking at the core of Thomas's doubts. He had asked himself those same questions in the darkest moments of the war, when the losses had seemed insurmountable. What was the point of fighting if there was nothing left to fight for? But he couldn't give in to that despair. Not now. "We fight because it's all we have left," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We fight because we have to. Because if we don't, then everything we are, everything we were, will be erased. And that's not something I can accept." The figure was silent for a long moment, its gaze distant, as if it were considering his words. Finally, it spoke again, its voice soft but resolute. "Very well. You have made your choice." Before Thomas could react, the world around him shifted once more, and he was back in the chamber aboard the alien ship. The sphere pulsed one last time before it dimmed, its light fading to nothing. The power that had once flowed through it was gone, dissipated into the void. Thomas stood there, breathing heavily, his mind racing. The figure's words echoed in his thoughts, but there was no time to dwell on them. The battle was still raging, and humanity's fate still hung in the balance. He turned and made his way back to his ship, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Victory was within reach, but the cost had been higher than he had ever imagined. And as he looked out at the broken remains of the fleet, he couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? Thomas stood on the command deck of the Valiant, the flagship now silent as the battle ended. A deep hum of the ship's systems echoed faintly around him, but it was quieter than it had been in months. The adrenaline that had coursed through his veins during the war was now replaced by a heavy emptiness. He looked out at the stars, and for the first time, there was no urgency, no immediate threat. The universe felt vast and silent, but not hostile, not in the same way it had during the war. Yet, the scars of the conflict remained, both in the vast wreckage floating in space and in the deeper, invisible marks left on his mind. The war had taken everything from him. His home, his friends, and the innocence he had once carried. He'd entered the conflict as another nameless soldier, faceless in the masses of humanity's last defense. But now he stood here, one of the few who had made it to the end. He was a survivor, but at what cost? The fleet, or what was left of it, drifted in formation. Ships were broken, some barely clinging to life. The alien vessels had retreated, though the aftermath of the battle still floated in the form of debris. Thomas knew that even though the immediate threat was gone, the road ahead would not be easy. He had been part of a war effort that had torn the galaxy apart, and now the task of rebuilding it fell on shoulders like his. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all sinking into him. He had fought because it was all he knew how to do. He had fought because survival demanded it. But as he stood here now, he couldn't help but wonder, was survival enough? Was it worth the price? Behind him, he heard footsteps. Sarah, the ship's communications officer, approached. She'd been with him from the early days, before the war had escalated into an all-consuming fight for existence. She had suffered as much as anyone, though her quiet determination had always been a source of strength for the crew. Now, there was a weariness in her step that hadn't been there before. "They're asking for you on the surface," Sarah said, her voice subdued. "The council wants to debrief." Thomas didn't turn around immediately. He kept his eyes on the stars. "Do they know what's left of the fleet?" "They do," she replied, stepping closer. "But I don't think anyone truly understands what we've lost." He finally turned to face her, searching her expression for answers he wasn't sure he could find. "And what about us? Do we understand?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes heavy with the same weight he felt. "We survived, but I don't know if we'll ever understand. Maybe we're not meant to." Thomas nodded slowly. That was the truth, wasn't it? In war, understanding was often lost in the chaos. The reasons blurred, becoming secondary to the sheer necessity of surviving the next battle, the next day. And now, after all that, he wasn't sure what survival even meant anymore. They walked together through the ship's corridors, past wounded crew members and damaged systems. The atmosphere was somber, filled with the kind of quiet that follows unspeakable devastation. Each step they took was a reminder of how fragile everything had become. As they reached the hangar, preparing to board the shuttle that would take them down to the surface, Thomas paused. "Do you think they'll rebuild?" Sarah stopped beside him, following his gaze to the ruined fleet. "The council? Humanity? Or us?" "All of it," Thomas said, his voice low. "After everything we've been through, do you think we can rebuild? Or are we too broken?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the stars, as if searching for something out there that could offer clarity. "We've been broken before. Humanity has always been broken in some way. But we've always rebuilt. Maybe that's just what we do." "Rebuild," Thomas repeated, as if testing the word. Sarah shrugged. "It's in our nature, I guess. We fight, we break. and then we try to put the pieces back together. Even when there's nothing left, we find something to hold on to." Thomas considered her words. They were true, in a way, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed this time. The losses were too great, the destruction too absolute. And yet, there was no other option, was there? They had to rebuild, because what else was there to do? As they boarded the shuttle and descended toward the planet's surface, Thomas stared out the window, watching the barren landscape below come into view. The surface was scarred, just like everything else. Craters from bombardments pockmarked the ground, and the remnants of old cities lay in ruin. But amidst the destruction, there were signs of life, small, fragile, but undeniably present. The council chambers were located in one of the few surviving structures, a fortified complex that had once been a government center. Now, it served as a meeting place for what remained of humanity's leadership. The war had culled the ranks, leaving behind only those strong or lucky enough to endure. Thomas had no love for the council. They were politicians, bureaucrats, but he knew their role was necessary. As they entered the chambers, the atmosphere was tense. The surviving members of the council sat at a long table, their faces etched with the same exhaustion that Thomas and his crew carried. They were survivors too, in their own way, though their battle had been one of decision-making and strategy, rather than front-line combat. "Commander Thomas," one of the council members began, his voice weary. "We've received word that the enemy forces have fully retreated. The war is over." Thomas didn't respond right away. The words hung in the air, almost surreal. Over. The war was over. It should have been a relief, but instead, it felt hollow. He had spent so long fighting that he wasn't sure how to exist without it. "And now what?" Thomas finally asked. His voice wasn't accusatory, but there was an edge of frustration in it. "What happens now?" The council members exchanged glances, as if unsure how to answer. It was clear that they had expected the question, but it was also clear that none of them had a real answer. "We rebuild," another council member said, echoing Sarah's earlier words. "We negotiate peace with the alien forces, and we begin the process of rebuilding our civilization." "Rebuild," Thomas said again, the word feeling heavier each time. "But what are we rebuilding for? What kind of future do we have left?" The council member hesitated. "A future of peace. A future where we can thrive again." Thomas shook his head. "And what if we can't? What if we've lost too much?" There was a long silence. The council didn't have the answers he was looking for. Maybe no one did. After a moment, one of the older council members, a woman with deep lines etched into her face, spoke quietly. "We don't know. We can't know. But we have to try." Thomas looked at her, searching her face for some sign of certainty. But all he saw was the same uncertainty that had been haunting him since the war began. They had to try. That was all they had left. The debriefing continued, but Thomas felt disconnected from it, his mind wandering back to the war, to the battles he had fought, the lives he had taken, and the lives he had lost. He thought of his comrades, those who hadn't made it, and he wondered what they would think of the world they had fought for. Would they think it was worth it? When the meeting ended, Thomas and Sarah left the chambers together, walking in silence through the ruined city. The streets were empty, the buildings shattered. But there were people here, survivors, trying to make sense of the new world they found themselves in. Children played in the rubble, their laughter a strange contrast to the destruction around them. It was a reminder that life, in all its fragility, continued. As they walked, Sarah spoke quietly, breaking the silence. "Do you remember what it was like before the war?" Thomas thought for a moment, trying to summon the memories. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "It was different," she said, her voice distant. "We were different." "Do you think we can ever go back?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "No. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we shouldn't go back." He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we needed to change. Maybe this war, as terrible as it was, showed us something about ourselves, something we needed to see." Thomas frowned. "And what's that?" Sarah looked up at the sky, her expression thoughtful. That we're stronger than we think. That even in the face of annihilation, we don't give up. We fight, we survive, and we rebuild. It's not easy, and it's not always pretty, but we do it. And maybe that's what makes us human. Thomas followed her gaze, looking up at the stars. For so long, they had seemed distant, cold, and indifferent to the struggles of humanity. But now, as he stood here, with the war behind him and the future uncertain, he felt something different. He felt hope. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future worth fighting for after all. The stars above twinkled faintly, and as Thomas stared into the vastness of space, he realized that the universe had always been waiting, and now it was theirs to explore, not as conquerors or survivors, but as something more, something stronger. The war was over, but humanity was just beginning.